TABOR is a state constitutional amendment that limits growth in both state and local budgets by a formula of inflation and population. And its effect is that it shrinks state and local budgets and spending over time. Now, Colorado is the only state in the country that has adopted TABOR in the Colorado form. What TABOR has done is it's strangled our budget slowly, and they were squeezing tighter and tighter every year. The interesting thing about TABOR, simply because of the way the economy worked, is that those bad effects take a few years to appear. But once they sort of show up, they have a tendency to hang around, and they tend to result in some pretty horrible consequences for the citizens. In fact, it got so bad that in November of 2005, Coloradans voted to put the TABOR revenue limit, this requirement that we can't increase spending or revenue by more than inflation plus population, we put it in timeout for 5 years. In 1992, Colorado ranked 35th in state and local spending for K-12 as a percentage of personal income. By 2000, we'd fallen to 49th in the country. In 1992, we ranked 30th when comparing average teacher salaries to annual earnings in the private sector. In 2002, we managed to make it all the way to 50th. In 1992, Colorado ranked 35th in state spending for higher education as a share of personal income. By 2004, we'd fallen to 48th. The appropriations for the University of Colorado in 2004 was roughly the same as it received in 1995 in real dollars, but it had an estimated 5,000 more students in 2004 than it did in 1995. In 2004, Colorado ranked 44th in the number of children receiving scheduled immunizations. And I have to add a little point to this. We also suffered a whooping cough epidemic. It is not coincidental when your kids aren't getting immunized that you have public health problems. And those are the kinds of things that are so invisible so often in this debate about taxes and spending. In 1992, Colorado ranked 23rd in the adequacy of prenatal care that we delivered. In 2002, we'd managed to get to 48th. In 1992, Colorado was 33rd in the percentage of low-income children lacking health insurance. And in 2004, I'm ashamed to say, we'd made it to the ranking of 50th. Now, some people like to just sort of ignore all of those kinds of human service or public policy outcomes because they say, but you know what it did do for us is it improved our economy. Colorado had a booming economy in the 90s, and we did. We had one of the fastest growing economies in the country, right up there with Georgia, quite frankly. And what we know is that most of the Rocky Mountain West was growing very, very rapidly during that period. And so what we decided to do is to try to test that notion of whether this limitation on spending or on revenue to the state actually resulted in any of that or caused any of that economic boom. Well, this analysis shows that when we compared the period 1980 to 1992, Colorado grew at about the average rate, about the same rate of most of the Rocky Mountain states. And, you know, that's where much of the growth is these days, and even during that period. In the period 1992 to 2004, the period in which TABOR was in place in Colorado, Colorado actually grew at a rate slightly below the states, our compatriot states in the Rocky Mountain West. So I just think that idea that somehow lowering these taxes is going to result in economic growth or employment growth, the statistics don't bear out that claim. As Deloitte & Touche reported, a good business climate depends as much on or more on the quality of public services as it does on state tax levels. Tom Clark has suggested for businesses to be successful, you need roads, you need higher education, both of which have gotten worse under TABOR and will continue to get worse. Now, why TABOR doesn't work is that the inflation plus population formula just doesn't capture the cost of goods and services that are purchased by the state. And there's two pieces of that component of that formula, and neither of them work particularly well. The first one is that we have to remember that CPI measures what consumers buy, not governments, and the census data that we use in the formula measures total population, not those subpopulations that are served by governments or public programs. So each year, when you can't quite cover the increasing costs that it takes to provide the same level of services as that you provided last year, the number of services that are available to your citizens shrink over time. And the problem with that, quite frankly, folks, is that sort of reinforces this notion that government doesn't perform very well. People have this notion that government spending is going up, but services are not being provided, and they immediately assume that's because of waste, fraud, and abuse. Not because there isn't enough resources to even keep up with providing the same level of services we provided the prior year. And the important thing about it, and one of the things that I find most troubling in these debates around the country, is oftentimes Tabor is sold as something that will attempt to actually make government services more efficient. And our experience in Colorado is that it has nothing to do with efficiency. It simply has to do with how much money is available. And oftentimes we've found that's resulted in very inefficient decisions, particularly purchasing decisions in the area of technology. The question, I think, for us in Colorado is, where does this whole thing stop? This timeout that I talked about required a Herculean effort. It came about only because our Republican governor at the time, Bill Owens, joined with the Democratic legislature to say that we have to do something because the next round of cuts that we were facing were so significant that it literally, many people predicted, the end of our publicly financed higher education system. What it resulted in was unanimous support from chambers of commerce and, quite frankly, active leadership in our business community. We couldn't have done it without the foresighted leadership of business folks throughout the state. We put together a coalition of 1,100 organizations representing everything from churches to schools to soccer clubs to chambers of commerce and everything else. And quite frankly, folks, we only passed the referendum C on a vote of 52% to 48%. This stuff isn't easy. Once it gets in the Constitution, it is a tough darn fight. Now, let me reiterate the sort of the takeaway, and that is that the limits with this constitutional kind of an approach, these limits do become permanent. Even if they don't work, getting out of it really becomes difficult. And I just gave you some statistics about how hard it was for us. We went after this 2 or 3 times and couldn't even muster the kind of money that we needed to have a campaign. And when we finally did get that $8 million campaign, we passed that timeout with a very small, very thin majority. The other thing I think the second thing I think is critically important to remember is that it really removes all the flexibility that legislators have and other policymakers have to address the dynamic changes in fiscal environments and continually changing circumstances and emergencies that confront state and local communities. The fourth, and I think one of the most significant things, is that money and influence become the name of the game. Statewide campaigns to pass constitutional overrides, as I mentioned, are very costly. What this does is it favors special interests that have those large amounts of money. You're really getting into this debate at the right time, before the legislature acts to put this thing on the ballot. This becomes a much more difficult challenge once you get into a campaign mode where everybody's sort of thinking and rationale ratchets down to a 15-second soundbite. Tabor is a gimmick that cannot deliver on all the promises that too often its advocates make. And the most important thing is, don't follow Colorado's mistake. The consequences for families, for children, and for the quality of life of all citizens in your state are simply too great.